The crimson sun cast long shadows across the Nevada Territory desert when Cole Hartwell spotted something that shouldn't exist. A wooden cross, maybe 10 feet tall, planted in the middle of nowhere, like a grave marker. But this wasn't marking death. It was marking something far worse. Cole had been tracking stray cattle from his ranch for 2 hours when he saw her. A girl couldn't be more than 12, tied to that cross with rough rope that had cut deep into her thin wrists. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Around her neck hung a silver medallion that made Cole's blood run cold. Only the pure shall see heaven. In 20 years of ranching in Nevada Territory, Cole had seen plenty of cruelty, mining accidents, claim jumpers, men driven mad by desert heat and silver fever. But this was different. This was deliberate evil dressed up as something holy. The girl's eyes followed him as he approached, wide with terror, but also something else: hope. She was alive, conscious, but her lips were cracked from thirst and her small body trembled from exhaustion. This discovery would set in motion events that would bring the devil himself to Cole's doorstep before the sun set again. "Easy now, little one," Cole said softly, dismounting quickly from his bay gelding. His weathered hands shook as he pulled out his knife to cut the ropes. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you down." The moment the ropes fell away, the girl collapsed into his arms like a broken doll. She was lighter than a sack of grain, all bones and fear. Cole wrapped her in his sheepskin coat, feeling how her whole body shook against him. 20 years of hard living had taught him to read suffering, and this child had endured more than most grown men. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, but she didn't answer. Maybe couldn't answer. Her throat looked raw, like she'd screamed herself hoarse against the empty desert. Cole studied the cross more carefully now, and his stomach twisted with realization. The wood was smooth, well crafted. The rope showed signs of repeated use. The post hole was deep and permanent. This wasn't the first time someone had been left here. As he lifted the girl onto his horse, Cole noticed fresh wagon tracks leading east toward the Silver Ridge Mountains. Whoever had left her here was long gone, probably counting on the buzzards and coyotes to finish what they'd started. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated how far a man would go to protect an innocent child. The ride back to Hartwell Ranch took an hour through the sagebrush and alkali flats. The girl clung to him with desperate strength, her small fingers digging into his shirt. She kept looking back over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit. When Cole's ranch house finally appeared in Crimson Valley, nestled between Red Canyon walls where Redemption Creek ran clear and cold even in the driest summers, she stirred for the first time. "Safe," Cole said, feeling her relax slightly. "That's my home, and nobody's going to hurt you there." Inside his modest kitchen, Cole set her down gently in a wooden chair, but she immediately curled into herself like a wounded animal. Her eyes darted to every window, every shadow, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. She was terrified of being alone, even for a second. "I'm going to get you some water," Cole said, moving slowly to the hand pump. When he turned his back, he heard a sharp intake of breath. The girl had pressed herself against the wall, trembling violently. Cole handed her a tin cup, watching as she gripped it with both hands. Her fingers were marked with small, precise scars, too deliberate to be accidents. Someone had hurt this child systematically, repeatedly. Around her ankles were rope burns, old and healed. This wasn't her first punishment. As she drank, Cole knelt down to her level, trying to make himself less threatening. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She touched her throat and winced, then shook her head frantically. Whatever they'd done to her had stolen her voice, maybe permanently. Tears filled her eyes as she pointed toward the mountains where the wagon tracks had led, then held up her fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 fingers, over and over. "4 others like you?" Cole asked gently. "4 more children?" She nodded, and the tears spilled over. Cole felt something cold settle in his chest. There were other children out there, and if this girl was here, tied to a cross like some twisted sacrifice, what was happening to them? The girl reached into her tattered dress and pulled out something that made Cole's hands clench into fists. A small piece of carved silver, shaped like an eagle, with words etched carefully into the metal, "The Children of Purity." On the reverse side was a name, Emma Grace, and a number, 1. "Emma," Cole said softly, and she nodded. "Emma Grace. That's a beautiful name." Emma held up one finger, pointing to herself, then 4 fingers again. She was number 1, the first child taken by whoever was collecting them. Cole's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. This wasn't random cruelty. This was organized, methodical. Religious fanatics were the worst kind of dangerous because they believed God was on their side. Emma pointed to the silver eagle again, then made a gesture with her hands like wings flying. She'd seen this symbol before, many times. It meant something to her captors, something important enough to brand each child with it. Her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd witnessed unspeakable things, and Cole realized that whatever had happened to her was just the beginning of a larger horror. "How long?" Cole asked, holding up fingers to help her communicate. Emma thought carefully, then held up both hands 3 times. 30 days. She'd been with these monsters for a month, and in that time, they'd collected 4 more children. The systematic nature of it made Cole's skin crawl. Cole climbed onto his roof with his spyglass, scanning the Silver Ridge Mountains to the east. The wagon tracks had led towards Satan's Teeth Canyon, a maze of rock formations where the Paiute had once hidden from cavalry patrols. Perfect place for a group that didn't want to be found. Through the spyglass, he caught a glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic. Smoke, thin and gray, rising from behind a red mesa about 5 miles away. Someone was camping up there, and from the amount of smoke, it wasn't a small group. Cole counted at least 3 separate fire sources, suggesting a camp large enough for multiple adults and several children. When he climbed back down, Emma was standing by his rifle rack, pointing urgently at a wanted poster pinned to his wall. The face staring back was that of Father Matthias Black, a former military chaplain who'd been run out of Virginia City for unusual practices with children in his congregation. The poster described him as extremely dangerous, wanted for kidnapping, and worse across 3 territories. Emma nodded vigorously and touched the poster, then pressed her hand to her own chest. She knew this man intimately. This was who had taken her and the others. Her reaction told Cole everything he needed to know about what this monster had done to her. Cole's hands clenched into fists as he read the poster more carefully. Father Matthias Black wasn't just some traveling preacher. He was a predator who used religion to justify his crimes. The poster mentioned his followers, called the Chosen Shepherds, who helped him collect and control children across the frontier. The silver eagles, the cross, the talk of purity, it was all part of his twisted gospel. "He's got the other children up in those mountains," Cole said, more statement than question. Emma nodded, then did something that broke his heart. She knelt down and folded her hands in prayer, but her whole body shook with terror. They'd made her pray to the same God they claimed while they tortured her. Cole helped her to her feet. "No more praying to their God, little one. We're going to stop them." Emma's eyes widened with something between hope and disbelief. She pointed to herself, then to the mountains, then shook her head frantically. She was trying to tell him it was too dangerous, that Black's followers were too many and too well armed. But Cole saw something else in her expression, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could save the other children. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Multiple riders coming hard from the east. Emma heard them too, and immediately ran to hide behind his kitchen table, her eyes wide with recognition. She knew those sounds intimately. She'd been found. Cole grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window. Through the dust cloud, he could count at least 6 riders dressed in black, like undertakers. Their horses were well fed and well cared for, suggesting this wasn't a ragtag band of outlaws, but an organized group with resources. At their head rode a tall man with a white beard, carrying a wooden staff topped with a carved silver eagle. Father Matthias Black had come to collect his lost sheep, and he'd brought an army with him. The riders spread out in a practice formation as they approached the ranch, demonstrating military training. These weren't just religious fanatics. They were soldiers in the service of a madman. Cole counted weapons, rifles, pistols, and what looked like dynamite attached to one man's saddle. They'd come prepared for a siege. Emma crawled to Cole's side, her small hand touching his arm. When he looked down, she was holding up both hands repeatedly. 10, 20, 30. She was trying to tell him there were more followers back at the camp. This group of 6 was just the advance party. Cole's heart sank as he realized the true scope of what they were facing. Black didn't just have 4 children and a handful of followers. He had built an entire organization dedicated to his twisted vision, with enough manpower and resources to wage war against anyone who opposed him. But as Cole watched Emma's terrified face, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He might be outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't outmatched when it came to pure determination. These monsters had hurt this child, were hurting other children, and thought they could use God's name to justify their evil. They were about to learn that some men would go to hell and back to protect an innocent child. The riders stopped 50 yards from Cole's front porch, close enough to talk, far enough to avoid a quick draw. Father Matthias Black sat tall in his saddle, his white beard flowing over his black coat like spilled milk. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, cold and empty of human warmth. Up close, Cole could see the man's true nature, predatory intelligence hiding behind a mask of religious authority. "Brother Hartwell," Black called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. "The Lord has led us to your door in search of one of his lost lambs." Cole stepped onto his porch, Winchester held loose but ready. Behind him, he could hear Emma's ragged breathing from her hiding spot. She was terrified, but she hadn't run. Maybe she knew there was nowhere to go in this vast desert, or maybe she trusted Cole enough to believe he could protect her. "Don't see any lost livestock around here, preacher," Cole replied, his voice steady despite the odds. "Might want to check with the Mexican families down south. They're always losing sheep." Black's smile was thin as a knife blade, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for a man who claimed to live humbly in the desert. "The lamb we seek walks on 2 legs, brother, a child pure of heart but tainted by sin. She was placed upon the cross of redemption this morning to contemplate her wickedness." And what wickedness would that be? Cole's finger found his rifle's trigger, noting how Black's men had positioned themselves for maximum tactical advantage. The child spoke back to her betters. She questioned the word of God as delivered through his chosen servant. Black's eyes hardened like winter ice, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. Such pride must be purged before it spreads like infection to the other children in our care. Cole's blood ran cold. These weren't just fanatics. They were slave traders hiding behind scripture. The other children weren't followers. They were prisoners being broken systematically. The way Black spoke about purging pride suggested methods that made Cole's stomach turn. "Well, preacher, I haven't seen any children today, just buzzards and rattlesnakes. Seems like you'd fit right in with both." Black's men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. But the preacher held up his staff, keeping them in check. He was studying Cole with the calculating look of a man weighing odds, noting the defensive advantages of the ranch layout and the clear fields of fire from the house. "The tracks of your horse lead directly from our place of prayer to your ranch, Brother Hartwell. God's truth cannot be hidden from his servants." "Funny thing about tracks," Cole said, noting how the afternoon sun was beginning to favor his position. "Desert wind erases them pretty quick. Makes a man wonder what he actually saw." Behind Black, one of his men leaned forward in his saddle, a younger fanatic with the eager look of someone desperate to prove his faith through violence. "Brother Matthias, the sun grows hot. Perhaps we should search his house for the child." Cole levered around into his Winchester's chamber, the metallic sound echoing off the canyon walls like a bell tolling. "First man through my door gets to meet his maker real personal-like." Black raised his hand again, but Cole could see the calculation in his eyes. 6 against 1 weren't impossible odds, but Cole had the advantage of cover, elevated position, and intimate knowledge of his property. Men would die, and Black needed his followers alive for whatever larger plan he was pursuing. "You speak of violence, Brother Hartwell, but we are men of peace. We seek only to return a lost child to her family." "Her family?" Cole laughed harshly, buying time while he assessed escape routes and defensive positions. You mean the 4 other children you've got chained up in those mountains? What kind of family needs to keep their kids in silver collars? Something flickered in Black's eyes, surprised that Cole knew about the others and the silver restraints they used to control the children. The preacher's mask of calm cracked just enough to show the monster underneath, revealing a man who enjoyed having power over the helpless. You have made a grave error in judgment, Black said slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the distance. The children under my care are being prepared for God's kingdom. What you call chains, I call salvation. What you call cruelty, I call necessary discipline. Emma's whimper carried from inside the house, soft but audible. Black's head tilted like a hunting dog catching a scent, and his smile turned predatory. Ah, the preacher said, raising his voice so Emma would hear every word. There is our lamb, Brother Hartwell. You will return her now, or face the consequences of defying God's will. The child knows what happens to those who run from their salvation. But Cole was done talking. He could see dust clouds on the horizon, more riders approaching from different directions. Black hadn't just brought 6 men, he'd brought enough followers to surround the entire ranch. The only question now was whether Cole could keep them all alive long enough for a miracle, or whether he'd have to make the ultimate sacrifice to give Emma a chance at freedom. Cole knew he couldn't win a straight fight against 6 men, with more approaching. But he didn't have to win, he just had to survive long enough to get Emma to safety. The desert had taught him patience and cunning, and both would be tested in the next few minutes. Tell you what, preacher, Cole said, lowering his rifle slightly in a gesture of false compliance. You and your boys look tired from riding in this heat. Why don't you water your horses at my well while we discuss this, like civilized men? Black studied him carefully, those pale eyes searching for deception. You would show hospitality to those who oppose you? Desert code. No man refuses water to another, no matter their differences. It was a calculated risk. Cole was betting that Black's twisted sense of righteousness wouldn't let him refuse such an offer, especially in front of his followers. The preacher considered for a long moment, then nodded to his men with the confidence of someone who believed divine providence was on his side. Brother Thomas, Brother Samuel, see to the horses, but keep your weapons ready. As 2 riders dismounted and led their animals toward the well, Cole mentally counted steps and angles. The well was positioned perfectly. Anyone using it would have their backs to the house and be 40 yards from cover. But more importantly, it would split Black's forces and give Cole multiple targets if shooting started. You know, preacher, Cole called out conversationally, trying to project calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. I've been wondering about something. If that girl was so sinful, why not just let the desert claim her? Why come all this way to fetch her back? Black's eyes glittered with something ugly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the fervor of a true believer in his own twisted gospel. Because she holds knowledge that could corrupt the other children, she has seen too much, learned too much about our sacred work. She must be purified before she can contaminate the innocent. Behind Cole, Emma's sharp intake of breath told him she understood exactly what purified meant, and it wasn't anything holy. The way Black savored the words suggested methods that would haunt Cole's nightmares if they survived this day. And if she cannot be purified, Black continued, his voice rising with religious fervor, then she will serve as an example to the others of what happens to those who rebel against God's chosen servants. Her suffering will teach the remaining children the price of disobedience. The 2 men at the well had relaxed, letting their horses drink while they wiped sweat from their faces with the confidence of men who believed their leaders' divine protection made them invulnerable. The other 4 remained mounted, but they'd spread out slightly, thinking they had Cole surrounded. They were wrong. Cole had spent 20 years fighting claim jumpers, rustlers, and every variety of desert rat that had ever drawn breath. He'd learned tactics from Paiute warriors and cavalry officers alike. These religious fanatics might know scripture, but they didn't know war. Preacher, Cole said, raising his voice slightly to mask the sound of Emma moving inside the house, I think it's time you and your boys moved along. The girl's not here, and you're wearing out your welcome. Black's face darkened with the righteous anger of a man who'd never been truly defied. Brother Hartwell, I grow tired of your games. We know the child is inside your house. Her cries of pain this morning when we disciplined her were distinctive. Return her now, or we will take her by force and make you watch what happens to those who interfere with God's work. The casual mention of Emma's torture made something snap inside Cole's chest. This wasn't just about saving one child anymore. This was about stopping monsters who used religion to justify their evil. "Over my dead body if necessary," Cole said, meaning every word. Black raised his staff, not a religious symbol, but a signal his followers had been waiting for. The four mounted men reached for their guns simultaneously, but Cole had been watching for this moment, reading the micro-expressions that preceded violence. As their hands moved toward leather, he dove sideways off his porch, rolling behind his water trough as the first shots rang out. Emma screamed from inside the house, but it wasn't fear in her voice. It was rage and defiance, the sound of a broken child finding her strength. Bullets splintered the wood above Cole's head as he pressed himself against the water trough, feeling the impacts shake the thick timber. The two men at the well scrambled for their weapons, but they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide, exactly as Cole had planned. His first shot took down Brother Thomas before the man could clear his holster, the heavy Winchester bullet spinning him around and dropping him into the well with a splash. From inside the house came the unmistakable crash of breaking glass. Emma was trying to escape through the back window, just as they'd planned during their brief whispered conversation. "Get the child!" Black bellowed, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. "Brother Samuel! Brother Joshua! Circle the house! She must not escape!" Cole rolled left and fired again, catching Brother Samuel in the shoulder as he ran toward the back of the house. The man spun and went down but kept crawling toward cover behind Cole's woodpile, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. The remaining mounted men had spread out, using their horses as shields while they returned fire with disciplined volleys. But Cole had one advantage they didn't expect. He knew every inch of his property, including the old Paiute fighting positions he'd discovered and improved over the years. He belly-crawled 20 feet to a depression hidden behind a false rise, a natural foxhole that gave him sight lines to both flanks of his house and the men trying to surround it. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, he could hear Emma moving through the rocks behind his house, her small feet finding the path he'd shown her that led to the hidden cave where he kept emergency supplies. But Brother Joshua was already moving to intercept her, having circled wide to cut off her escape route. Through his sights, Cole could see the man's face, young, eager, completely convinced that hunting a 12-year-old girl was God's work. Cole's shot took Joshua's hat clean off, the bullet passing inches from his skull and sending him diving for cover. But it gave Emma the precious seconds she needed to reach the rocks, though Cole could see her struggling to climb with her injured hands. That's when he heard the sound that made his blood freeze, a child's cry of pain echoing off the canyon walls. Emma had fallen from the rocks, and Joshua was already running toward her, his pistol drawn and ready to finish what Black had started that morning on the cross. Cole made the hardest decision of his life. He abandoned his defensive position and ran toward the canyon wall, knowing that every step made him a target for 4 different rifles. The first bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. The second bullet missed by inches, kicking up dust at his feet. But Cole reached Emma before Joshua did, throwing himself between the fanatic and the child just as the man's pistol fired. The bullet meant for Emma slammed into Cole's chest instead, punching through his ribs and tearing into his lung. Cole hit the ground hard, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled paint. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, but each breath was agony, and he could taste copper in his mouth. But he was alive, and more importantly, Emma was safe behind him. Emma knelt beside him, her small hands pressing against his wound with surprising competence. For the first time since he'd found her tied to that cross, she spoke, a whisper so soft only he could hear, "Thank you, Papa." The word hit him harder than the bullet had. In her moment of greatest terror, this brave child had found a father figure worth protecting, worth saving. Brother Joshua stood over them, his pistol aimed at Cole's head, young face flushed with the righteousness of someone about to commit murder in God's name. "Brother Matthias, I have them both. Shall I finish the heretic now?" But as Black and his remaining men approached for the kill, something unexpected happened. The thunder of hoofbeats rolled across the desert from the south, Not more of Black's followers, but a U.S. cavalry patrol that had been tracking the preacher across 3 territories. Captain William Cross led 12 soldiers into Cole's yard, their carbines already aimed at Black's men with military precision. The preacher's face went white as he realized his carefully planned operation had become a trap. "Father Matthias Black," Cross called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, child endangerment, murder, and crimes against the United States territory of Nevada. Drop your weapons immediately." The fanatics were outnumbered 2-1 and outgunned by professional soldiers. But Black wasn't finished. He raised his staff like a weapon, his pale eyes burning with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "You cannot stop God's work," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "These children belong to the Lord. They are being prepared for his kingdom, purified through righteous suffering." "The only place you're going is prison and then the gallows," Cross replied coldly. "Now drop your weapons, or we'll drop you where you stand." Brother Joshua, still standing over Cole and Emma, made a fatal mistake born of fanatical loyalty. He swung his pistol toward the soldiers, believing his divine mission would protect him from earthly weapons. Captain Cross put a bullet between his eyes before he could fire, the young fanatic crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. The remaining followers of Black immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands, their faith in divine protection evaporating in the face of military efficiency. As the soldiers secured the prisoners with practiced movements, Cross knelt beside Cole, assessing his wounds with the eye of a man who'd seen plenty of combat casualties. "How bad is it, Rancher?" Cole coughed, tasting blood but managing a weak smile. "I'll live, Captain, but there are other children up in Satan's Teeth Canyon. 4 more kids that need saving before Black's people hurt them." Emma nodded urgently and pointed toward the mountains, then held up 4 fingers. Her voice, still weak but growing stronger, carried across the yard. 4 children. Silver chains. Very scared. Cross understood immediately, his face hardening with determination. "Sergeant Wilson, take half the men and search those canyons. Find those children and arrest anyone guarding them. Use whatever force is necessary." As the sun began to set over the Nevada Territory desert, Cole watched half the cavalry ride toward the mountains while the other half secured Black and his followers. Emma sat beside him, no longer trembling, no longer afraid. She'd found her voice and her courage, and both would serve her well in the days to come. Father Matthias Black was shackled hand and foot, his staff broken and his followers scattered. As they loaded him into a prison wagon, he fixed Cole with those pale eyes one last time. "This is not over, heretic," he hissed. "God's work will continue. Others will take up the sacred mission." But Cole just smiled, his arm around Emma's small shoulders. "Maybe so, preacher. But today evil lost and innocence won. Sometimes that's enough." 3 hours later, Sergeant Wilson returned with 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, all thin and scared but alive and unharmed. When they saw Emma safe beside Cole, they cried tears of relief and joy, their voices joining in a chorus of freedom that echoed off the canyon walls. Father Matthias Black and his surviving followers were taken to Carson City to face federal charges. All would hang within the month, their twisted interpretation of God's will meeting earthly justice at the end of a rope. Emma stayed with Cole as he recovered from his wounds, and he helped her remember how to laugh, how to trust, how to be a child again. 6 months later, when the circuit judge came through and asked if Cole wanted to make their arrangement official, both of them said yes without hesitation. Sometimes the desert gives back more than it takes away. Sometimes broken people find exactly what they need to become whole again. 6 months after the shooting, Hartwell Ranch had transformed into something Cole never expected, a real home filled with laughter, purpose, and the daily miracles of healing. Emma Grace had grown 3 inches and gained the healthy roundness that came from regular meals in the absence of fear. Her voice had returned gradually, like a songbird learning to trust the world again, and now she chattered constantly about everything, from the geology of the canyon walls to the habits of desert foxes. But it was the deeper changes that truly amazed Cole. Emma had revealed herself to be remarkably intelligent, devouring every book in his small library and teaching herself advanced mathematics from his surveying manuals. She'd also shown an extraordinary artistic gift, creating detailed drawings of the desert landscape, the rescued children, and scenes from their new life together. Most importantly, she'd begun to heal from the trauma that had nearly destroyed her spirit, though Cole knew the scars would always remain. The 4 children they'd rescued had all been successfully returned to their families, but they stayed in touch through letters that arrived weekly. Emma had become their hero, the brave girl who'd endured the worst of Black's cruelty and helped lead the cavalry to their rescue. Their gratitude and love meant everything to her, giving her a sense of purpose beyond her own healing. Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who ran the trading post in nearby Dust Haven, had taken Emma under her wing, teaching her to cook, sew, and speak perfect Spanish. More importantly, Maria understood trauma in ways that Cole couldn't, having fled her own dangerous situation years earlier. She helped Emma work through nightmares and panic attacks with a combination of practical wisdom and maternal love. Dr. Henderson, who treated Cole's gunshot wounds, made regular visits to check on Emma's progress. He marveled at her resilience and intelligence, encouraging Cole to consider sending her to a proper school in Carson City when she was ready. But Emma had other ideas about her future, ideas that would surprise everyone. The circuit judge, Honorable William McKenna, arrived on a crisp October morning when the aspens in the high country had turned gold and the air carried the promise of winter. Cole had been both anticipating and dreading this day for weeks, knowing that official questions would be asked about Emma's permanent placement. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge McKenna said as they sat on the front porch, watching Emma play with an orphaned fox kit she'd rescued near the creek. "I've reviewed all the case files from the Black investigation. The child has no living relatives that we can locate. Her parents died in a Comanche attack on their wagon train, and she has no extended family." Cole's heart pounded as he waited for the inevitable bureaucratic decision that would tear his world apart. "What does that mean for her future, Judge?" "It means the territory needs to decide her placement. There's an orphanage in Carson City that specializes in children who've experienced trauma. Or," the judge paused, studying Cole's weathered face with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd seen every variety of human nature, "or responsible citizens can petition for formal adoption, assuming they can provide proper care and education." Emma looked up from her fox kit, having heard every word with the sharp attention of a child whose life had been decided by adults too many times. Her dark eyes met Cole's, and in them he saw not fear, but hope mixed with desperate longing. "Judge," Cole said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like to file that petition. Emma Grace belongs here, with me. This is her home, and I'm her family now." The paperwork took 2 hours to complete, with Judge McKenna asking detailed questions about Cole's finances, his plans for Emma's education, and his understanding of the responsibilities involved in raising a traumatized child. Emma sat through it all with the dignity of someone twice her age, occasionally adding her own thoughts about her future. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Emma Grace stood beside Cole on the porch of their home, wearing a beautiful new blue dress that Maria Santos had spent weeks sewing for this special occasion. When Judge McKenna asked if she understood what adoption meant, Emma's clear voice rang across the valley with absolute certainty. "It means I get to stay with my papa forever. It means I'm safe and loved and part of a real family again." Cole had to wipe his eyes at that, overwhelmed by the fierce love he felt for this remarkable child who'd survived hell and chosen to trust him with her future. In all his 50 years, he'd never heard sweeter words or felt prouder of anything he'd accomplished. That evening, as they sat by the fire with the official adoption papers signed and witnessed, Emma showed Cole something she'd been working on in secret, a detailed drawing of their life together over the past 6 months. It showed the ranch, the rescued children, the cavalry battle, and dozens of small moments of healing and happiness. At the bottom, in her careful script, she'd written, "The true story of how Papa Cole saved me and how I saved him back." "I want to frame this and hang it in the parlor," Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maria taught me to write stories too, not just draw pictures," Emma said proudly. "She says I'm smart enough to be a teacher someday, or maybe even a writer who tells people about important things." "Smartest girl in Nevada territory," Cole agreed. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Emma considered this seriously, her face reflecting the wisdom that came from experiencing both the worst and best of human nature. I want to help other children like the ones we saved. Maybe be a teacher who helps scared kids learn to trust again, or work with the law to catch bad people who hurt children. I want to make sure no child ever has to go through what we did. Cole smiled, recognizing the strength and compassion that would make her exceptional at whatever she chose to pursue. I think you'd be excellent at either one, and I'll help you achieve whatever dreams you have. As winter settled over Crimson Valley, their new family established routines that brought them both comfort and purpose. Cole taught Emma to ride properly, to shoot accurately, to read the weather and understand the land. Emma taught him Spanish words she'd learned from Maria, showed him how to draw the rock formations with artistic accuracy, and helped him write letters to the families of the other rescued children. On Christmas morning, Cole gave Emma a special gift, a silver locket with their ranch brand engraved on one side and the words Emma Grace Hartwell on the other. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of them taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through in November, capturing their happiness for posterity. "Now everyone will know you belong here," Cole said as he fastened it around her neck with trembling fingers. Emma's gift to him was even more precious. A leather-bound journal she'd made herself, with the adventures of Cole and Emma written on the cover in her careful script. "For writing down our stories," she explained, her eyes bright with love and gratitude, "so we never forget how we found each other and how love can heal even the worst wounds." As 1883 dawned over the Nevada territory, Cole Hartwell realized that his life had been divided into two distinct parts, before Emma and after Emma. Before, he'd been a lonely man going through the motions of living, working his ranch with competent efficiency, but no real joy. After, he was a father with purpose, happiness, and a future worth fighting for every single day. The other rescued children visited whenever their families could make the journey, turning the ranch into a gathering place for healing and hope. Emma had become their unofficial leader, helping them process their trauma through art, storytelling, and the simple power of knowing they weren't alone. Cole watched her natural gift for helping others emerge, and he knew she'd found her calling. Dr. Henderson brought books from Carson City, recognizing Emma's exceptional intelligence and thirst for knowledge. By spring, she was reading at a level far beyond her years and showing particular aptitude for both writing and mathematics. Her trauma had left her with an adult understanding of human nature, but her natural curiosity and joy had survived intact. Maria Santos became like a grandmother to Emma, teaching her not just practical skills but also the deeper wisdom of women who'd survived and thrived despite terrible circumstances. The three of them formed an unlikely but loving family unit, each contributing something essential to Emma's healing and growth. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings when they sat together reading by lamplight, Cole would remember that terrible morning when he'd found a broken child tied to a cross in the desert. Now, looking at the confident young woman Emma was becoming, he marveled at the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of unconditional love. The silver locket around Emma's neck caught the firelight as she bent over her books, and Cole realized that the inscription was more than just words. It was a promise fulfilled. Emma Grace Hartwell belonged here, with him, in this place where love had conquered cruelty and family had triumphed over evil. The desert had indeed given back more than it had taken. It had given him a daughter, a purpose, and a future filled with hope. And in return, he'd given Emma something even more precious, the chance to heal, to grow, and to become the remarkable woman she was destined to be. 1 year after her rescue, Emma stood on the same ridge where Cole had first spotted the cross, now transformed into a young lady of 13 with confidence in her bearing and kindness in her eyes. She carried wildflowers to place at the spot, not as a memorial to her suffering, but as a celebration of her survival and the new life that had grown from that terrible moment. "Thank you," she whispered to the desert wind, though whether she was thanking God, fate, or the man who'd chosen to save her, even she couldn't say. What mattered was that the cross was gone, replaced by a small garden that Maria had helped her plant, a symbol of life growing where death had once threatened. Cole watched from below as his daughter performed her private ceremony, understanding that this was her way of closing one chapter and beginning another. Emma Grace Hartwell was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was a survivor, a fighter, and most importantly, a young woman who'd learned that love was always stronger than hate. As they rode home together through the Nevada desert, Cole realized that their story was far from over. Emma would grow up, pursue her dreams of helping other children, and eventually start a family of her own. But the bond they'd forged in fire and blood would last forever, a testament to the power of choosing love over indifference, courage over fear, and hope over despair. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and harsh and full of hidden wonders. And somewhere in that vastness, other children might be waiting for their own miracle, their own chance at salvation. Cole smiled, knowing that when that time came, he and Emma would be ready to answer the call. After all, they'd learned the most important lesson the frontier had to teach. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, and sometimes the greatest love stories are about a father and daughter who saved each other when the world had given up on them both. As our story closes over the Nevada territory, Cole Hartwell and Emma Grace have created something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. A family forged not by blood, but by courage, compassion, and the simple revolutionary act of choosing to love and protect each other when the world had given up on them both. Their tale reminds us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or superhuman strength. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to ride past someone who needs help, or opening your heart to a broken child who desperately needs healing. Cole saw a little girl who'd been abandoned by the world and tortured by monsters, and he chose to make her his world. Emma found a man willing to die for her, and she chose to live for him. But here's what I want to know from you. If you encountered a child in Emma's situation today, what would you do? Have you ever been part of a chosen family that proved love is stronger than blood? Or maybe you've witnessed someone's life completely transformed by a single act of kindness that changed everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Nevada, like our heroes, somewhere else in the American West, or halfway around the world in places where children still need heroes like Cole Hartwell. Because stories like Cole and Emma's remind us that courage, compassion, and the power to change lives exist everywhere, in every community, in every one of us. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and the bell notification, because every week we bring you incredible true tales of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when it mattered most. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their story isn't over, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the family we choose becomes the family that saves us from ourselves. Remember Cole Hartwell the next time you see someone who needs help. Remember that you have the power to be someone's turning point, someone's second chance, someone's miracle. Because the best stories aren't just about the heroes we admire, they're about recognizing the hero within yourself and finding the courage to act when innocent lives hang in the balance. Thanks for riding with us through this incredible journey across the Nevada frontier, where love conquered cruelty, family triumphed over evil, and two broken souls found exactly what they needed to become whole again. Until next time, keep believing in second chances, chosen families, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit that refuses to surrender to darkness. She wasn't looking for rescue. She wasn't hoping for love. Miriam only wanted shelter, just long enough to catch her breath, to protect her daughter, and to carry her unborn child into a world less cruel than the one they fled. But when a quiet man opened his door near the frozen river, something unspoken passed between them. Something tender, something strong. Neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of a family. The river ran slow that morning, just like it had for hundreds of years before anyone dared speak its name. Wide and shallow, it moved like an old song hummed low. Steady, worn, familiar. Mist curled off its back in tendrils, and the spring sun was trying, half-hearted, to burn through the last memories of winter. Miriam stood at the edge, her feet pressed into damp earth, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other tightly wrapped around her daughter's smaller fingers. Her boots were soaked. Her shoulders ached. The hem of her dress had frozen stiff where it had dragged through snow just days ago. But she stood straight, her spine made of something that hadn't broken yet. Juania said nothing. The little girl just stared out over the slow-moving water, her braids stiff with cold, her cheeks flushed beneath faint smudges of dirt. She was quiet by nature, like her father, like the wind right before a storm. Miriam didn't know how far they'd come, not exactly, just that there was no further road behind them worth walking, and across the river he waited. The man hadn't called out, hadn't moved much at all. He stood near the tall pine at the bend, one hand resting on a wooden bowl, the other hanging loose at his side. He had appeared maybe an hour ago, long enough for Miriam to decide he wasn't going to draw a gun. He was watching them, not cruelly, not with suspicion, just watching, the way a coyote watches fire, half curious, half wary. Finally, he stepped forward. Miriam's grip tightened on Juania's fingers, and the girl pressed close to her side. The man raised both hands, empty. Then he crouched by the river's edge and set the bowl down on a flat rock, letting it rest there like an offering. "I got food," he said, his voice carrying across the water. "Bread. Stew from last night. Still warm." Miriam said nothing. The man didn't move. "Ain't much of a trap if I'm already standing here. Just a cabin. Just me." Still, she said nothing. Words were expensive, and trust had long since bankrupted her. "I'm Luke," he added. "Cabin's over that ridge." He didn't smile, didn't sell charm, just spoke, then waited. Miriam looked down at Juania, who was watching the bowl. The girl hadn't eaten in almost a day. Miriam had shared the last of the dried berries yesterday morning and promised they'd find something soon. The wind shifted. Miriam stepped forward, slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving the man. He didn't move. When she reached the edge, she nudged the bowl with the toe of her boot, lifted it, sniffed, then handed it to her daughter. Juania ate fast but quiet. Luke didn't speak again. When Juania handed the bowl back, Miriam nodded once. "Storm coming," he said. "Won't be safe out here after sundown." Miriam knew that. She also knew her body couldn't take another cold night. So she looked again at his eyes, not at his stance, not at his hands, not at the faint scar across his cheek, but at his eyes. And for once they didn't lie. She nodded again. Luke turned without another word and walked back through the trees. Miriam and Juania followed. The cabin sat in a grove of pine and oak, tucked low into a hillside like it had been grown there. Smoke rose from the chimney, straight and clean. The front porch sagged, but the roof looked sound. A line of split logs stacked neatly near the wall, and a small corral sat empty, its fence in need of repair. Luke opened the door and stepped inside. Miriam followed with Juania. The heat hit her like a wave. The hearth burned steady. A pot hung above it, gently bubbling. The air smelled of pine, stew, and the faintest trace of tobacco. "Bench is clean," he said, nodding toward the wall. "You can sit. I got extra blankets." Juania didn't wait. She made her way to the fire and curled close to it. Miriam stayed standing. Luke watched her for a long second. Then he went about his business. Adding a log to the fire, fetching a ladle. He poured soup into a tin bowl and handed it over. Miriam took it. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect it. "I don't take folks in," he said after a while, sitting down across the room. "Ain't got much. Ain't looking for company." Miriam glanced down at her belly. "Didn't come looking," she said quietly. "Just walked until we couldn't walk no more." Luke nodded. "Well, storm's gonna hold you a while." She nodded back. He didn't ask where the baby's father was. She didn't offer. That night, Juania slept beside the hearth, bundled in 2 wool quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Miriam sat awake long after the girl had drifted off, her eyes scanning the room in slow, measured lines. Luke sat in the rocker by the door, whittling something small from a block of pine. He worked in silence, not glancing her way, not asking questions. When the fire crackled too loud, Juania stirred. Miriam hummed under her breath, just a few notes, something her mother used to sing. The child settled. Luke looked up briefly. "That's a good sound," he murmured. "Helps her sleep." "Helped me too." That was the first time he smiled, just barely. Morning came gray and sharp. The wind had shifted. Snow would come soon. Miriam rose early, checking on Juania. brushing ashes from her dress. Luke had already been out. His boots sat near the hearth, steaming slightly, and the scent of fresh kindling clung to the room. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Luke was splitting wood near the side of the house, his swings even and practiced. He looked up, then nodded toward a bucket of water by the door. "Spring's clean. Don't worry." "I wasn't," she said. He paused, studying her. "You got anyone who might come looking?" Miriam's jaw tightened. "No one I want finding me." Luke nodded. He didn't press. The two stood in silence as the wind moved through the trees, brushing the edge of the clearing like it was searching for something. Miriam shivered once. Luke noticed. "Fire'll hold till midday," he said. "You're welcome to stay warm. Longer if you need it." Miriam looked back toward the cabin where Wanya still slept soundly. She looked back at Luke. "I don't need charity." "This ain't charity," he said. "It's decency." And somehow that made all the difference. The next morning, Miriam awoke to the unfamiliar sound of silence. Not the kind of silence that weighed heavy like snow-laden clouds, but a soft one, broken only by the distant call of a jay and the steady trickle of the river nearby. Her first instinct was to look for Wanya. The girl wasn't curled up beside her anymore, and the fire pit had burned down to gray ash. Panic sparked, a mother's first reflex. But before she could rise, she heard giggling. Then she smelled corn. Miriam stepped outside the cabin, her hand instinctively cradling her round belly. The early light filtered through the trees, making diamonds of dew on the tall grass. Just ahead, near the bend in the river, she saw them. Wanya sat cross-legged near a flat stone, eating roasted corn from a husk, her cheeks already sticky with butter. And Luke, the cowboy, was crouched beside her, showing her how to fish using a hand-carved pole and a piece of old leather string. He didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Wanya asked enough questions for both of them. When Miriam stepped closer, her shadow touched them first. Wanya turned. "Mama, he showed me how to feel for fish in the water." Luke glanced up and gave a small nod of greeting. He looked the same as the night before. Broad, quiet, deliberate. The only difference was that the hard edge in his expression had softened a little. Just enough. "I didn't mean to let her wander," he said, standing as Miriam approached. "I didn't ask you to mind her," Miriam replied, though her tone wasn't sharp. She looked at Wanya, who held out the half-eaten corn with a grin. "He made breakfast." Luke cleared his throat. "Not much. Just coals and what I had in the saddlebag." Figured she was hungry. Miriam took the corn, not because she needed food, though she did, but because she understood what it meant. She bit into it slowly, the heat grounding her more than any word could have. "You're not used to company, are you?" she asked after a long silence. Luke gave a short shrug. "Not much of it, no." Wanya had gone back to her fish, dipping the line into the river with the concentration of a hawk watching a mouse hole. Miriam watched her for a moment, then turned back to Luke. "Neither am I." They stood that way a while, strangers made less strange by a quiet morning and a child's laughter. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a step toward it. Back at the cabin, Miriam set to sweeping the floor with a branch broom while Luke fed logs to the stove. It creaked when he opened it, and smoke curled up in lazy spirals through the chimney. Wanya sang softly to herself from the back stoop. The song was old, handed down from Miriam's grandmother, a lullaby sung in Lakota about the moon guarding the dreams of children. "She sings like your people," Luke said from where he crouched beside the firebox. "She is my people," Miriam replied gently, "and her father's. He died 3 winters ago." Luke didn't ask how. Instead, he said, "She sings well." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It simply was. Miriam sat slowly at the edge of the cot, one hand rubbing small circles over her belly. She was beginning to feel the ache of travel lifting, though her body remained stiff from nights sleeping beneath a sky that offered no shelter. The baby kicked once, and she smiled faintly. Luke noticed. "Due soon?" Miriam nodded. 3 weeks, maybe less. He hesitated before asking, "And there's no one waiting?" "No." Her voice was flat. "I lost my sister to fever last spring. The rest, they're scattered or gone. I tried to return to the northern camps, but winter came hard. Juania and I, we made it as far as here. Luke looked down at his hands, fingers laced together, calloused and cracked. I wasn't expecting visitors. Miriam tilted her head. And yet you didn't turn us away. He shrugged again. Didn't seem right. You knocking like that. In that storm. Even ghosts don't knock, not after dark. A small smile tugged at the corner of Miriam's lips. Then maybe I'm not a ghost. Luke stood, brushing ash from his pants. No, ma'am. I reckon you're not. That afternoon, Luke brought out his tools and began mending a broken piece of fencing near the outer edge of the trees. Juania followed him like a loyal pup, carrying nails in a small tin pail, and asking 1,000 questions about horses, hammers, and hawks. Miriam watched from the porch, slowly stitching a small blanket with faded blue thread. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was preparing for something to go wrong. The air, the land, even the silence seemed to hold its breath. Not in fear, but in peace. When the sun dipped low, Miriam called for Juania to wash up, and Luke packed away his tools. Supper was thin stew and flatbread cooked over coals, but they ate it like a feast. The warmth in their bellies didn't come from the food alone. Later that night, when the girl had curled herself deep into sleep, Miriam sat by the fire with her hands folded over her growing stomach. Luke sat opposite her, whittling a piece of driftwood into something that looked like a bird in mid-flight. She watched him for a long time before speaking. Do you ever miss it, being with people? Luke didn't look up. Sometimes. Then why stay out here? He paused, the blade still in his hand. Because once you've buried too many things in one place, the silence starts to feel safer than the company. Miriam nodded. She understood that kind of silence all too well. She reached for her cup, sipped the last of the tea, and then added softly, silence isn't the same as peace. Luke looked at her then. Really looked. The flicker of firelight catching in his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Miriam leaned back, the baby shifting gently beneath her ribs, and for the first time in years she let the quiet settle not as a shield, but as a space where healing might begin, a space where maybe, just maybe, tomorrow wouldn't be so hard. And for Luke, sitting there across from a woman who didn't flinch from truth, and a child who followed him like he might never leave again, the silence no longer felt like the edge of loneliness. It felt like the beginning of something. By the time the late morning sun peeked through the thinning clouds, Miriam had already laid out a basket of washed linens along the split-rail fence. The storm had passed in the night, taking with it the clawing wind and that heavy, breathless silence that had seemed to wrap the valley in suspense. Now there was only the sound of birds calling from the trees and the faint rustle of leaves as the air moved again. Not sharp, not cruel, just air, clean, living. She stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the day touch her face. Her hand brushed instinctively over her swollen belly, not from pain but habit. She had started counting again. Days, movements, even hiccups, each moment a quiet reassurance that the little one growing inside her still held on, still believed in this place, in her, and maybe even in the man who now walked these woods like he belonged to them. Juania came skipping around the bend from the creek, hair damp, arms muddy up to her elbows. Mama, I saw a turtle, a big one with moss on his back. I named him Sage. Miriam smiled as she reached for a towel. And what did Sage have to say this morning? Juania thought for a moment, eyes scrunching up with dramatic seriousness. He said we can stay here, that the turtles already made space for us. Miriam laughed softly. Well then, I suppose it's settled. She knelt to wipe Juania's arms, the child giggling as cold water tickled her skin. Luke's footsteps came behind them, not hurried, not heavy, just steady, like him. I cleared the brush out by the lower trail, he said, nodding toward the wooded slope behind the cabin. If you're feeling strong, we could start planting tomorrow. Miriam nodded, glancing up at him. His shirt was damp with sweat, dirt streaked his forearms, and yet he looked more at peace than she had ever seen him. There was something in the way he spoke now. Not softer, not exactly, but less guarded. Planting tomorrow sounds good, she said. Then after a pause, I was thinking about the back plot. That patch gets the first light. Might be good for beans. Luke looked toward the spot, then nodded. Beans, then. They didn't speak again for a moment. There wasn't need. They moved together easily now, as if a rhythm had quietly grown between them without either noticing. It was in the shared looks, the unspoken chores, the way Luke had started pouring a second cup of coffee every morning without asking. Later that day, Miriam stood by the hearth stirring a pot of cornmeal, Wania humming in the background as she twisted dried flowers into a string. Luke entered with a handful of rough-carved wood, fence repairs likely, but paused when he saw them. His eyes lingered just a little too long on Miriam's hands as she stirred, then dropped briefly to the curve of her belly. "You've been on your feet too long," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm fine," Miriam said, though her ankles ached and her back throbbed. Luke stepped forward, took the spoon gently from her hand. "Sit," he said. "I can stir." She raised an eyebrow at him, smirking. "You know how to stir?" He shrugged. "I can follow in a straight line." She let him take over, seating herself slowly at the edge of the table, watching him as he moved carefully between the pot and the fire. Wania came to sit at her feet, resting her head lightly against Miriam's knee. "Mama," she whispered, "is Luke gonna stay?" Miriam looked down at her daughter, brushed her fingers through tangled strands of hair. "What makes you ask that?" Wania shrugged. "He builds things, fixes stuff, feels like someone who stays." Miriam's throat tightened. She looked back at Luke, who was now tasting the spoonful of cornmeal with a slight wince. "Too much salt?" she asked. "Number just not enough," he said. She smiled, but her mind lingered on Wania's question. Would he stay? Could he? There was no promise in his eyes, no declaration, and yet the way he'd taken over the pot, the way he'd moved her gently toward rest, it wasn't just help, it was care. After supper, as the sun dipped low and painted the inside of the cabin with honeyed light, Luke brought out something unexpected, a wooden cradle. It was rough still, unfinished, but the shape was clear, the rockers smooth, the curve of the base graceful and strong. Miriam gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. "You made this?" she whispered. Luke set it down gently by the hearth, then nodded. "Started it after the first rain. Meant to finish it by first thaw." Wania crawled over immediately, running her hands over the smoothed edges. "It's for the baby?" Luke nodded again. "If you want it." Miriam stood, walked slowly to the cradle, and reached down to touch its edge. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw something deeper than patience in his eyes. Hope, not loud, not desperate, just quietly waiting. "I want it," she said. That night, Miriam couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind outside, to Wania's soft breathing, and to the familiar creak of the old boards under Luke's boots as he paced by the fire. She rose slowly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the main room. Luke was sitting in his chair, whittling something small. He looked up when he heard her, eyes catching hers in the dim firelight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No," she said. "You?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." She sat across from him, silence stretching between them like fabric, warm and holding. "I never meant to stay here," she said after a moment. "When I came, I was just trying to survive. Just one more night, one more step forward." Luke nodded but didn't interrupt. "I still don't know what tomorrow looks like, but tonight feels like a beginning." He set the carving down, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then let's make it one," he said. Miriam looked at him, the fire painting gold across his face, and felt the first true ache of something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Trust, not certainty, not safety, just the small, sacred start of believing in someone again. She reached forward slowly and laid her hand over his. And Luke, steady, quiet Luke, closed his fingers gently around hers. Not every beginning needs a bang. Sometimes it starts with a cradle, a bowl of stew, and a man who offers his hand without asking anything in return. By the time the moon had climbed high over the cottonwoods, casting silver ripples across the river behind the cabin, Miriam could no longer deny the change that had begun to settle over them. It wasn't just in the way Wania laughed more freely now, or how her daughter had begun to follow Luke around like a shadow, peppering him with questions about trees, clouds, and how to start a fire with no matches. It was in the quiet comfort that bloomed between them, in the way their silences no longer ached but soothed. That night, as Wanya slept soundly beneath a quilt, her tiny limbs sprawled without fear or tension, Miriam sat by the hearth, her hands cradling a cup of tea made from dried mint Luke had foraged days ago. Luke sat across from her, whittling a small bird from soft pine, the shavings falling like snow onto the wooden floor. "I haven't seen her this light in moons," Miriam said softly, her voice nearly lost to the crackle of the fire. Luke didn't look up, but the corners of his eyes crinkled. "She trusts you. That makes it easier to trust everything else." Miriam smiled faintly. "She trusts you too." The silence stretched, but not uncomfortably. She watched the firelight dance along the lines of his face, along the scar that cut across his jaw, faded now but still telling its own story. She didn't ask about it. He hadn't asked about the scar on her ankle either, the one hidden beneath her moccasin that had never healed properly after that final escape. "You always live alone?" she asked after a moment, her fingers tapping lightly against the mug. He nodded slowly. "After the war, after the killing, I didn't want people around me. Didn't trust my hands not to carry what they'd done." Miriam looked down into her cup. "And now?" "Now," he exhaled, setting the carving down gently on the table between them. "I trust the silence less than I trust you." Miriam's throat tightened. She wasn't used to words like that. Honest, clean, unsought. Most of her life had been bartering for kindness or preparing for its withdrawal. But Luke spoke them like truths carved into wood. "You remind me of my uncle," she said after a pause. "He was quiet too. But his quiet wasn't empty. It was listening." Luke tilted his head. "Is he still?" She shook her head. "Number they took him in the first roundups. He used to say the land remembers everything." Luke nodded. "It does. That's why I chose this spot. After the cavalry swept through, I stayed. Thought maybe if I could make something here again, it would balance what was lost." She glanced around the cabin, the carefully patched windows, the stocked shelves, the beams oiled against rot. "You have," she said. They said no more that night, but when Luke rose to bank the fire, Miriam watched him move with the ease of a man who no longer had to prove himself through noise. Before he turned in, he paused, glanced at her. "That crib," he said, nodding toward the half-built wooden frame in the corner. "It'll be done by week's end." Miriam blinked, taken off guard. I didn't want to presume." "You're here," he said. "That's all the presuming I need." She bit her bottom lip to steady her breath. "Thank you." He nodded once, then stepped into the back room where he slept. She sat alone a while longer, the warmth of the fire sinking into her skin, into her chest. The world outside was still wild, still cruel. But here, tonight, the wind rattled the shutters like a lullaby, and for the first time since fleeing the reservation, Miriam felt the stirrings of something like safety. The next morning, Miriam awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the rhythm of Wanya's laughter echoing outside. She rose slowly, her back aching with the weight of late pregnancy, and pulled her shawl over her shoulders before stepping onto the porch. Luke was down by the river, trousers rolled, sleeves pushed up, and Wanya stood beside him barefoot, squealing as she dipped a pan into the shallows. "She's panning for stones," Luke called up, grinning. Miriam chuckled. "And what's the prize?" "Smoothest pebble gets to name the next loaf of cornbread." Wanya held up a gray stone, no bigger than a thimble. "This one looks like an ear." "Then I guess dinner's named after Auntie Elsie," Luke called back. Miriam covered her smile with her hand. It was a foolish thing, a game, but in its simplicity was healing. They were writing a new story, not to forget the old, but to stand beside it. Later that afternoon, Miriam sat on the porch carving a strip of hide for new moccasin ties while Luke shaved cedar for the crib. Juania napped nearby, curled up with her rag doll beneath the shade of the cabin eaves. "You know," Miriam said, squinting up at Luke, "if I were the suspicious type, I might say you're trying to build a life here." Luke didn't look up from his work. "Would that be so bad?" Miriam said nothing for a long while. The river sang behind them. The wind danced between the grass. Then she said quietly, "No. It wouldn't be bad at all. That night, Miriam stood by the water while the stars wheeled overhead. She ran her hand over her swollen belly, breathing in the scent of pine and river. Behind her, Luke stepped up, carrying a lantern. "You okay?" She turned, and the lantern light caught the curve of her cheek. "Yes, just thinking." "Dangerous thing," he said gently. "Not tonight." They stood together at the river's edge, side by side but not touching. The quiet between them was full of things unspoken, but understood. That they had come through something. That more might still come. But tonight the fire burned warm. The roof held steady, and Wanya was asleep without fear. It was enough. And for the first time in years, Miriam dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the road ahead would not be walked alone. The early spring winds carried the scent of thawed earth and damp pine, brushing against Miriam's cheeks as she stepped outside. Her belly had grown more pronounced now, pressing gently against the fabric of her dress, a constant reminder of both fragility and life. The cabin behind her stood solid and warm, the smoke from the chimney curling slowly upward into the pale morning sky. Inside, Wania was still asleep, curled under her favorite quilt. Luke had already gone down to the river, as he did most mornings now, checking the traps or fetching water with quiet purpose. Miriam paused by the porch rail, her fingers brushing over the grain of the wood. It was smoother now than when they'd first arrived. Luke had sanded it down last week, said he didn't want her snagging a splinter when she leaned there in the evenings. It was such a small thing. But small things meant everything now. She moved slowly toward the path that wound around the side of the cabin, careful with her steps. The world felt like it was shifting beneath her feet lately, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made her aware of how nothing stood still forever. The snow was nearly gone from the grass, only patches lingering in the shadows. Buds had started to show on the low branches. Spring was coming, real and certain. Down by the water, Luke stood knee-deep at the riverbank, shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands working with smooth, deliberate motions as he untangled a snare. He heard her footsteps before she spoke and turned to greet her with a glance and a quiet smile. "You're up early," he said, voice low and familiar. "The baby doesn't let me sleep much these days," she replied, folding her arms gently under her belly. He set the snare aside and waded back toward her, the water pulling against his boots. He moved with that same calm he always did, but she could tell in the way his eyes moved over her face and down to her stomach that he carried worry, even if he didn't speak it aloud. "Come sit," he said, leading her to a dry rock where she could rest. He shrugged out of his coat and laid it down before she could argue. "You don't always have to take care of me," she said, but there was no edge to her voice. Not anymore. "Yes, I do," Luke answered simply. And that was that. They sat together in silence for a while, the wind lifting Miriam's braid gently off her shoulder. The river sang beside them, full with meltwater, alive with the shifting of seasons. A hawk circled overhead, calling out once before disappearing into the trees. "Do you ever miss what you had before?" she asked him suddenly. Luke glanced at her, thoughtful. "You mean before the cabin? Before you and Wanya?" She nodded, eyes on the horizon. He exhaled slowly. "I miss the quiet sometimes, not because it was peaceful, because it was predictable. I knew what every day would be. No hope, no disappointment, just repetition." She turned to face him. "And now?" Luke looked at her long, steady. "Now I don't know what tomorrow brings, but it matters more, because you're in it." Miriam felt tears rise, unbidden and unexpected. She blinked them away with a small laugh. "You're not the man I thought I'd find when I knocked on your door that day. And you're not the woman I expected when I opened it. But I'm glad it was you." They sat a little longer. Miriam reached for his hand and placed it over the swell of her belly. The baby kicked, just once. Luke froze, then smiled wide and stunned like it was the first time he'd touched something holy. That night, as Wanya curled up in her bed, with a new wooden doll Luke had carved for her, Miriam sat by the fire stitching a small baby blanket. Her hands moved slowly but with purpose, threading love into every corner. Luke sat across from her, working silently on another project, mending a cracked pail. "You think the baby will come early?" he asked, not looking up. "Maybe," she said. "He's stubborn already." like someone I know. Luke smirked but didn't argue. Later, when the fire burned low and the cabin was filled only with the hush of sleep and soft breath, Miriam lay with her head on Luke's shoulder, his hand resting over her belly. She whispered into the dark, "I think this is what I was always looking for." Luke didn't answer. He just held her closer. And outside, the thawed earth breathed softly under the stars, holding their future steady in its arms. The first frost came early that year. It traced the window panes with delicate ice feathers and turned the river's surface to glass. By morning, even the edges of the log steps leading down to the creek had stiffened with a thin, crunching layer. Miriam felt it in her back before she saw it, an ache that settled deep, one she had come to know well during the final weeks of carrying a child. But there was something about this ache that felt different, not just discomfort, change. She stood on the porch with one hand braced on the beam, her other hand resting protectively on her round belly. The sun had not yet risen, and the world glowed with that faint, silver-blue haze that came just before dawn. Behind her, she could hear the soft scuffling of Wanya waking from her cot, her daughter already murmuring something about the chickens. And inside the house, Luke was stirring too. He always rose early, always checked the traps before breakfast. Miriam didn't call out to him. She stood quietly watching the breath rise from her mouth, the steam of it catching in the morning stillness, like smoke from a sacred fire. Today felt like a turning. It wasn't just the cold. It was the slow but certain pull inside her, the rhythm of something ancient waking in her bones. Her child, his child, was almost ready. And though they hadn't spoken of it directly, she knew Luke felt it too. They'd come so far in so short a time. What had begun with silence and survival had become something more rooted, more honest. He still didn't speak often, but when he did, every word counted. When she moved, he noticed. When she rested, he adjusted the task without needing to be asked. And in the quiet evenings, when Wania fell asleep curled by the hearth with her dolls, Luke would sit beside Miriam and run his hand gently along the small of her back, easing the tightness there without a word. The night before, he had placed his hand over her belly. The child had kicked, strong, sure, and Luke had looked up at her, startled. She had laughed, and for the first time, he had laughed with her. Not a full-bellied laugh, but a quiet one, a release, like a door being opened. Now standing on the porch, Miriam whispered softly into the dawn, "You'll be born into peace. I promise you." Behind her, the cabin door creaked, and Luke stepped out, tugging on his coat. He nodded toward her belly. "Was it the baby?" he asked. She nodded. "He's talking with his feet again?" Luke's lips twitched into a smile. "Strong one." "Like his sister," Miriam replied, glancing back toward the cabin. Luke stepped beside her, scanning the sky. "We should gather the last of the squash before the ground hardens, and the tobacco leaves. We can hang them in the loft." She nodded, grateful for the distraction, the movement. But before she turned, she reached for his hand. He hesitated, then laced his fingers with hers. That alone warmed her more than the rising sun ever could. They spent the day quietly preparing, working with the rhythm they had come to know. Wanya helped as much as her small hands could. She carried baskets, dusted shelves, and fed the hens who clucked loudly as she passed. She was growing tall, longer limbs, bolder voice. There were moments when Miriam would watch her daughter from the doorway and feel tears prick her eyes, knowing how close she had come to losing all of it that day by the river. It was near dusk when the first pain hit. Miriam had been kneeling to tie the last of the herbs, her back aching but manageable, when a sudden, deep tightening gripped her lower belly. She froze, breath caught. The cord slipped from her hands. Luke noticed instantly. He crossed the yard in 4 strides. "Miriam!" She looked up at him, trying to hide the fear. "It's starting." Luke didn't say a word. He simply helped her up and guided her inside. Wania ran ahead, grabbing blankets just as she had been taught. Miriam had spoken to her gently over the past weeks, explaining that when the baby came, it would take time, and there might be pain, but everything would be all right. Wania had listened with wide eyes and a fierce determination to help. As night fell, the small cabin filled with warmth, firelight, and the scent of boiled water and cedar smoke. Luke moved without panic. He soaked cloths, stoked the fire, fetched fresh water from the creek, and whispered soft words when Miriam's contractions tightened her into silence. There were no midwives, no mothers or aunts, no village women to sing her through it. But there was Luke, his hand in hers, his breath steady, his presence unshakable. Hours passed. The moon climbed high. At one point, when Miriam cried out, sweat beading on her brow, Luke knelt beside her and whispered, "I'm here, I'm here." And she believed him. Near dawn, as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the soft hum of wind and prayer, the child arrived. A boy, dark-haired, fierce-lunged, and perfect. Luke wrapped him carefully in a buffalo hide swaddle and placed him into Miriam's waiting arms. Her whole body trembled, not from weakness, but from the immensity of it, the relief, the love. Juania crept to her side, eyes wide. Miriam smiled at her. "Come meet your brother." The girl tiptoed forward, peering down. The baby squirmed, then hiccuped softly. "He looks like you," Juania whispered. Luke crouched beside them, his eyes wet but smiling. For the first time, their home felt whole. In the days that followed, the snow came heavy, but inside the cabin, there was nothing but warmth. Luke carved a cradle, every edge sanded smooth. He added bear symbols for strength and hawk feathers for clarity. Miriam rested and nursed, wrapped in quilts passed down through generations. Juania sang lullabies she didn't know she remembered, songs her father had taught her once beside a fire far away. One evening, as they sat around the hearth, Luke whittling, Juania reading aloud, the baby asleep in Miriam's arms, Luke spoke softly. "What will we name him?" Miriam looked up. She hadn't said it aloud yet, but she had known for some time. "Tate," she said. "It means wind in Lakota, because he came on the breath between storms." Luke nodded. "Tate Hawken," Miriam smiled. "The strong wind." That night she slept deeply, safe, loved. Not because the world was easy, but because she had chosen to stay when running would have been simpler. Because Luke had opened his door, not out of pity, but because he had needed them as much as they needed him. And because love, the kind that takes root and grows slowly, had finally made its home there. Under a sky streaked with starlight, a new family began, not from blood alone, but from bond, from healing, from quiet, patient, earned belonging. This was not the end, only the beginning. Some families are born in blood, others in fire. But the strongest ones, the ones that last, are carved in silence, shaped in small kindnesses, and stitched together with everyday grace. Miriam didn't ask for a new beginning, but she found one anyway. In the strength of a man who spoke little, and the laughter of a child who'd almost forgotten how. And Luke, he didn't rescue her, she rescued him right back. If this story moved you, if you've ever found love where you least expected it, tell us in the comments. Because maybe, just maybe, someone needs to hear that it's never too late to build something whole again.